All right. Well, good morning. Let's go ahead and get ourselves started for today. So this is Political Science 11. It is Monday, the 27th of April, 2020. And welcome to our weekly Zoom get together. It's really lovely to have so many of you with me this morning. Always look forward to these Monday morning get togethers. Always love to talk about this material with you. Really, makes me wish that we could be back together face to face, certainly, but this really is a really nice substitute, and I'm always glad to be able to spend this time with you. So today, we are going to be going ahead and doing a few things. First thing, just going to update you some announcements, reminders, that sort of thing, dealing with the class. Then we will go ahead and spend the bulk of our time together this morning, getting into some of the information, dealing with the next assignment, the current discussion forum post assignment that you are working on, dealing with Thomas Hobbes, the English political philosopher. And of course, as you know from the schedule on Canvas, the discussion forum post for Hobbes is due this coming Wednesday. So that is April 29th at 11:59 p.m. And of course, that does not count the 3-day grace period, the 72-hour period that applies to all of our assignments in this class this semester, so that if you're not able to go ahead and get your discussion forum post for Hobbes up by the Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. deadline, you can always go ahead and you have additional 3 days, additional 72 hours to submit that assignment to me via Canvas. And that assignment will be accepted at full credit. In other words, there will not be any point deductions for lateness. So our main subject for today is Hobbes. So before we go ahead and get into that, just a few announcements, reminders, that sort of thing. So first of all, I've received test number 2 from a good number of you at this point. Some of you have not yet handed it in. And if that applies to you, please do go ahead and get test number 2 submitted to me as soon as you reasonably can. And I would appreciate that. And I'm looking to start working on grading those tests probably sometime tomorrow. So be looking in the next couple of days to see your grades for that test number 2. That's the first reminder. Second reminder, of course, is that if you need to get a hold of me for questions about this class or anything that you think that I might be able to help you with, of course, it is always a good thing to send me either a Canvas message or an email anytime. But also you do have the additional opportunity if you want to talk to me about something dealing with the class or anything else for that matter. You do also have the opportunity to join me one-on-one during my twice weekly Zoom virtual student hours. And remember, those take place every Monday and Wednesday afternoon between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And remember, I'm not lecturing, I'm not presenting information like I do during these weekly Monday morning get-togethers that we have. Instead, the virtual student hours are basically just the online Zoom version of what I would be doing normally if we were still face-to-face on the LAC campus when you would come into my office and we would chat about whatever we need to chat about. So if you want to take advantage of those twice weekly virtual Zoom student hours, remember the link, the Zoom link and the password for those student hours is not in the same place where you get the link for this weekly meeting. It is instead available on our Canvas homepage for this class. If you scroll down right past the picture where it says basic course information, you'll see both the Zoom link and the password for those virtual student hours. And remember, when you jump into the virtual student hours, you will first be placed into a waiting room. And as soon as I am done working with whoever student I am working with at the time, I will go ahead and bring you out of the waiting room and we can chat one-on-one. So if you get put into a waiting room when you jump on to the student hours, just be patient, hang out for a few minutes, and I will get to you as soon as I can. All right. So I think that is it as far as announcements, reminders, that sort of thing. So before we do anything else, let me remind you, of course, that this meeting, as all of our Zoom meetings is being recorded. The recording will be made available to you by Zoom, usually within about 12 hours after the meeting concludes. So if you want to rewatch this meeting, then all you have to do is click on the ConferZoom link in the left-hand margin of our Canvas homepage, and then click on the recordings link once you get to the ConferZoom page. And then you can scroll down, look at the various links for the various dates for these meetings. Click on that link. You'll probably be prompted for a password. If you are, use the password that I gave you to access this meeting this morning in our Canvas announcements, and you should be able to access this recording and rewatch it to your heart's content as much as you want. So before we do anything else, before we get into talking a little bit about Thomas Hobbes, let me ask if there are any questions about anything that I've just talked about, or any questions that you have about the class in general before we go ahead and get started. And if you have questions or comments at any time during the proceedings, please do feel free to either unmute your mic, say what you have to say, or if you'd rather not, please feel free to put your question or comment in the group chat and we can deal with it there as well. So any questions or comments before we go ahead and get ourselves started with Hobbes for this morning? Anybody? Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get ourselves started? So hopefully you have available to you right now the notes on Hobbes that I posted for you on the modules page on Canvas last week. It might also be handy if you have your Wolin book available to you as well. So what I want to do is just in the time that we have remaining, and so we have probably about a little under 45 minutes left together this morning, I do want to go ahead and hit some of the highlights in those class notes that I posted for you on Canvas dealing with Thomas Hobbes, and maybe throw a few questions out to you, maybe get a little bit discussion going if it's warranted to do so. And of course, please feel free to jump in at any time with questions, comments, challenges, anything like that, because that's what I'm here for. So let's go ahead and get into this. And, you know, if you've had a chance to do the reading both in the Wolin book, that's chapter 8 of Wolin, dealing with Thomas Hobbes, and also if you've had a chance to take a look at what is said in our other little book, The Political Philosophy, a Graphic Guide by Robinson and Groves. Both those sources, both Wolin and Robinson and Groves, agree that for most folks who study Western political philosophy, Thomas Hobbes is really seen as being the first thoroughly modern political philosopher. And what that means is that if you think about folks like Machiavelli that we talked about a week or so back, Machiavelli, in a sense, was kind of a bridge between, an older variant of Western political thought and the more modern thinkers, beginning with Thomas Hobbes and others of his time period. So in a sense, Machiavelli has a leg both in kind of pre-modern Western political thought, but also in modern Western political thought as well. But again, Wolin And most folks who study this stuff would argue that Machiavelli is the first really truly modern Western political philosopher. And that label really does have some important implications that we should really talk about at the outset of our discussion today. And really, I think one of the main characteristics that really does confirm this idea of Hobbes being the first truly modern Western political philosopher is what I have listed for you in our class notes for chapter 8 of Wolin in Roman numeral number 1. And that is what Wolin sees as being a very important sort of anticlimax in Hobbes's thought. And I give you a brief quote there from page 223 of Wolin, where Wolin says, referring to Hobbes, what appeared as a grandiose promise of certain benefits, such as an, quote, eternal, unquote, constitution, turned out in the end to be considerably less. And so I want to focus our attention, excuse me for just a second. Sorry about that. What really one of the first sort of major elements that really sort of confirms Hobbes's status as a modern political philosopher is this idea that in trying to figure out a workable political model for Western societies in the modern world, in a very unstable modern world, as we'll talk more about in a few minutes, Hobbes was really trying to jump to the next level. Because if you think back to our discussion a week or so back dealing with Machiavelli, remember what I was saying, that when it came to Machiavelli's political thought, you know, he really was trying to create this very practical, useful, effective sort of how-to manual for, you know, young men of noble birth in the Italian city-states to try and help them have a successful political career and, you know, move up in terms of power and prestige and that sort of thing. But at the same time, in doing so, being able to try and bring about some degree of workable order in society at the time, because as we were saying, you know, living in the various Italian city-states of the time, Machiavelli himself was dealing with a lot of instability, a fair bit of chaos and confusion, though by no means nearly as much chaos, confusion, or instability as Hobbes himself would experience in his native England. Because remember, and this is talked about, Wolin talks about this a little bit, but actually Robinson and Groves talk about this in even a little bit more detail on pages 48 to 58 of the Political Philosophy, a Graphic Guidebook, that, you know, Hobbes actually had to flee. He had to escape into France from his native England as a result of the extreme chaos and instability that was taking place during the brief attempt at Republican, not as Republican with a small r, not a capital R. We are not referring to the modern Republican Party in the United States, but there was a brief period of a little over 2 decades in England where the English royal family was thrown out by this rather revolutionary leader, guy by the name of Oliver Cromwell, and he tried to establish a representative democracy in England during his period of control. And it was really rather unsuccessful. Cromwell himself proved to be not much of a fan of democracy. He was a pretty authoritarian type of person. His rule was very brutal. So much so that the English people got fed up with Cromwell rather quickly and restored the monarchy in England, though with a different a different variant, a different branch of the royal family than what was going on, what was on the throne prior to Cromwell. But Cromwell was this really despotic, brutal, violent, authoritarian ruler. And so things were so bad, so unstable, so chaotic, so dangerous in England at the time that good old Thomas Hobbes had to flee to France to try and escape the violence, to try and survive the violence that was going on. So obviously, all of this had a huge impact on the thinking and ultimately the political philosophical model that Hobbes himself developed. And this is what really causes the real sort of modern variation of his political thought. Because going back to Machiavelli, his political thought, his whole model really was on the level of tactics. That is specific tactics that young, upwardly mobile men could use in the Italian city-states to gain greater political power and do all that sort of thing. But basically, Machiavelli was saying, okay, so when faced with this situation, you should do this and say this to this person and that to that person. So it's a very low level of thinking. It is kind of a tactical level of process. On the other hand, Hobbes was very different. Hobbes was trying to develop a workable long-term political and governmental model, not just for England, but for other states, other countries around the world, that was kind of pitched on a much higher level of thinking, a much more sort of grand strategic level of thinking than just the simple tactical prescriptions that Machiavelli was providing in The Prince and others of his works. So Hobbes was not just saying, okay, here's the things, the types of tactics that political leaders can use to thrive and survive and get by over a short period of time. Hobbes had something much more permanent, much more long-term, much more grand in mind. What Hobbes was trying to create, as I mentioned there in that brief quote from Wolin at the very top of the notes, is this concept, essentially, of an eternal constitution. Hobbes believed that through a decidedly scientifically based process, and we'll talk about what a scientific approach to politics and government looked like for Hobbes, as opposed to other political philosophers in a few minutes. That's talked about a little bit further down in the notes, right? But the big picture for Hobbes was, let's create this governmental model, this political process, this political system, this series of governing institutions and laws and rules and all that sort of thing that would be able to successfully govern a country, a state, on a permanent basis. Hobbes had so much trust in his scientific method of political analysis and discovery that he believed that he could discover an eternal constitution. That is a governmental system that could essentially persist indefinitely, that could last and be effective in its governance forever and ever and ever. Okay. And so that really is kind of a unique hallmark in Western political thought that we start to see with Thomas Hobbes. And that is why so many experts on this refer to him as the first modern political philosopher. Because he was really the first to say that a political regime could be established that would be workable and effective and sustainable for the foreseeable future, indefinitely, eternally, that sort of thing. Now, obviously, Wolin, when he talks about this on page 223 in chapter 8, gives us a really rather big spoiler alert. Because again, look at that quote that I give you there in Roman numeral number 1. Wolin says, what appeared as a grandiose promise of certain benefits, such as an, quote, eternal, unquote, constitution, turned out in the end to be considerably less. So in other words, Wolin says, well, you know, Hobbes had grand expectations. He made all these amazingly big promises, but in the end, he really failed to deliver. He failed to be able to create a framework for analysis that would allow Hobbes, or anyone else for that matter, to create an eternal constitution that is an indefinitely successful and effective system of governance for any state. So that's kind of the first really important point that I want you to take, both from the readings, but also from the class notes that I gave you on Canvas. So is that making sense to us so far on a Monday morning? Any questions, comments, problems, complaints, challenges, that sort of thing about this notion? That really part of what defines Hobbes as being the first truly modern political philosopher was his belief in his ability to create a philosophical and political framework that would allow for, among other things, an eternal constitution. Are we all good with this so far on a Monday morning at 10:22 Pacific Daylight Time? Questions, comments, anything like that, please feel free to either unmute your mic and ask, or to go ahead and put a question or a comment in the group chat. Anybody so far? Okay, so and I will for purposes of this class, I'll kind of do what a good friend of mine who teaches law over at Loyola Law School always says in her contracts class with her law students, that silence constitutes not only acceptance but also understanding. So again, if something doesn't make sense, or you have a burning comment that you want to make about any of this stuff, please don't hesitate. Open up your mic, put something in the group chat. Otherwise, I will assume that it makes sense and I'll move on to the next thing. So let me do that. So let's take a look at some of the stuff talked about in Roman numeral number 2 in our class notes. And look what it says there. It says that Hobbes' political philosophy attempts to start off in an area where Machiavelli is found to be sorely lacking. And I then give you a quote from page 214, 215 in Wolin. There was no, quote, comprehensive principle, some notion of a unifying consensus for coping with the interest-ridden nature of the new politics. For if interests were the expression of what is particular to an individual or group, the pursuit of different interests was latent with conflict and ultimately anarchy, unquote. Now, let's take that quote and break it down and talk about it a little bit, because essentially Wolin is saying, in Wolin's usual rather fancy sounding language, that, you know, Machiavelli's stuff, really good, really interesting, really useful, but really rather limited in its utility and its application. Because what Wolin is saying here is that one of the biggest flaws, one of the biggest areas of Machiavelli's political thought that was pretty sorely lacking was that While Machiavelli was great at giving practical advice to young noble persons about how to deal with day-to-day political situations and elevate their positions and elevate their power and maybe temporarily bring some order to the chaos that was the Italian city-states, Wolin says, biggest limitation with Machiavelli is what? There was no comprehensive principle. There was no underlying sort of grandiose model to provide long-term guidance about how you create and maintain and sustain a workable system of government and politics that will allow for there to be order and stability and peace in society. And for Wolin, part of what is causing so much chaos, so much instability, whether it's in the Italian city-states that Machiavelli lived, or whether it is in, Cromwellian England that poor Thomas Hobbes had to escape from to France. He's saying, look, Wolin's saying, look, the major sort of genesis, the major sort of creating factor for all this instability and chaos that folks like Machiavelli and Hobbes was experiencing was incredible conflict amongst various segments of people in a particular society. That, remember the old concept of the politics of interest that we started talking about early on in the semester, back when we were still meeting face-to-face on the LAC campus on Monday and Wednesday mornings. Remember the politics of interest that we talked about, and how the Roman government was really trying to deal with this issue for the very first time. This recognition that there are different groups of people in society that have different needs, different wants, different desires, that the community, that the society is not as homogenous, is not as alike as you might want to think or hope, that society can be a lot more diverse than that, then different people in different parts of society have different experiences, different needs, wants, and desires. And as societies become bigger and as societies become more complex, this problem of conflicts of interest amongst segments of society begins to arise. And so what Wolin is basically saying is that as society becomes more complicated and you have more groups in society with greater conflicting interests, it's not enough to follow a Machiavelli who says, well, look, here is how officials in government can work with people from day to day to try and restore peace and some level of calm and all that sort of thing. No, Wolin's saying, look, at some point, society becomes so complicated and becomes so enmeshed in all of these competing interests, all these conflicts amongst different groups in society, that Machiavellian political theory is not enough. A tactical, low-level approach at temporarily solving problems in society is not enough. That you have to take more of a big picture approach. If you are the political philosopher, you have to go ahead and essentially climb that mountain. As we talked about previously, you have to climb out of the valley to the mountaintop so you can look down on society and kind of see the big picture and say, hey, there are so many conflicts going down there in the valley. There are so many conflicts of interest going on amongst the different groups of folks in society that we need to figure out a longer term, much more big picture solution. We have to come up with enduring, adaptable, sustainable institutions of government and processes of politics that will allow this to do it. If not, the competing interests in society are finally going to tear society apart. Okay. And so that is the basis of Wollen's criticism of Machiavelli and his hope for what Hobbes was trying to accomplish, even though he wasn't able to deliver, obviously, on all the promises that he was making with his possibilities of an eternal constitution and all that sort of thing. Now, why is this? Why is society becoming more divided? Why is society becoming more riven with conflict? Whether it's the Italian city-states in Machiavelli's time, whether it's England in Hobbes's time, whether it's France at the dawn of the revolution in 1789, what is bringing about this increasing complexity, this increasing conflict in society? We'll take a look at point capital A under Roman numeral 2 in your notes. And look what it says there. And this is such an important point. Notice that I put that one quote from Wollen, page 215 into 16 in bold type. That's my not so subtle way of saying, hey, pay really close attention to this point, to this quote. And look what it says there. It asks, on what basis could the practice of government be conducted once the society was no longer a community? Listen to that again. On what basis could the practice of government be conducted once the society was no longer a community? This is a very key question that Hobbes tries to answer through his political philosophy, his political model, his attempt at creating essentially an eternal constitution. And, you know, hopefully, as I was reading that question to you a couple of times just a moment ago, you were automatically sort of driven to paying particular attention to the very last word in that question, right? That word called community. Because if you think back to the earlier stages of this course, if you think back to when we were still on campus meeting face-to-face in the T building, you'll remember that for some of the ancient political philosophers, whether we're talking about folks in the Greek city-states like Plato and Aristotle, or whether we are talking about the early Christian philosophers, particularly folks like Augustine and Aquinas, this notion of community was very much front and center in their political considerations, right? Because if you think about it, if you are trying to effectively govern and govern in a sustained way a particular society, that job can be significantly easier if the folks living in that society are already fairly unified, are fairly well connected with each other in areas outside of, you know, large scale politics or government or that sort of thing. So for example, if people in a particular society are already bound fairly tightly together through their shared economic activities or their shared cultural activities, shared language, you know, shared spiritual or religious traditions, that sort of thing, the more connected, the more people in a society that are truly part of a meaningful community, chances are the more stable that society is going to be and the easier it's going to be to govern that particular society, right? Because you don't have all these different elements of society, everybody kind of going off in their own ways, in their own different directions. You have this relatively close knit, this relatively connected community. As my dog gives some of his political commentary there in the background, I apologize for that. He's really into Hobbes. What can I tell you? He really relates to the concept of the state of nature, as you can imagine, because he practices the state of nature all of the time. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But you see the point that I'm making? In a society where there truly is a unified and well-connected to community, that society is going to be harmonious, that society is going to be more homogeneous, and that society is going to be easier to govern, right? And we see this idea, in Platonic thought, in Aristotelian thought, and also in the thinking, both the theology and the political philosophy of folks like Aquinas and Augustine and people like that. But think about it. Think about the process that slowly begins in the age of empire. Think of the process that begins as the Roman Empire becomes much larger in scale in terms of in terms of geography. I can't talk on Monday morning either. I think I need more caffeine, right? But it becomes more complex, more diverse, more complicated as it expands, as the Roman government is able to conquer more and more societies, more and more peoples on the periphery of Roman territory, and the place just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And so the more diverse the Roman Empire becomes, the more unmanageable it becomes. And so the Roman government begins to struggle. How do we begin to readjust how we govern to take into account this greater diversity of more broadly conflicting interests in our increasingly far-flung empire? And we know, of course, that the Romans are ultimately unsuccessful in making this transition, right? They are unable to come up with a workable model of governance that effectively takes into account the politics of interest, because eventually the Roman Empire kind of just disintegrates, it kind of implodes, kind of collapses under its own weight. And so as time moves on, as we move more into the time of Machiavelli and certainly of Hobbes and Hobbes's contemporaries, this is a huge consideration, because you have these incredibly diverse societies with all of these different competing and divergent interests. And so guess what? These societies, like, England in the era of Cromwell, they really aren't communities. They aren't these homogeneous, unified, connected groupings of people that Plato talked about, that Aristotle talked about, that the much earlier philosophers talked about. And so this was a big challenge for folks like Hobbes. And this is why Hobbes has to climb up the mountain out of the valley and take a look at the big picture and try and figure out this much more strategic, this much more large scale, higher level, much more permanent political system, hopefully under this eternal constitution, to try and restore greater order in society. How do you practice government once your society is no longer a community? And Wolin goes on. I give a quote to Wolin from Wolin on page 216, also again, point capital A under Roman numeral number 2, and look what it says there. Wolin says that, quote, "The quest for justice, however, was not directed towards finding some general ethical principle which would unite members of society, but rather an inquiry into the rational grounds for private interest or particularity. That is why any man should call anything rather his own, sorry, is a typo there, than another man's. Now, what all this is saying is that it it illustrates how difficult it is to create a workable, sustainable government that can maintain order in a community of diverse compete or in a society of diverse competing interests where there is no real community. What's the problem here? Well, because think about it. In the past, especially if we're talking about Plato or Aristotle, or if we're talking about folks like Aquinas or Augustine, right? In the past, something that a political philosopher could grab onto, that the political philosopher could use as a basis for unifying a society would be, trying to connect that society, connect that community under some general unifying, comprehensive ethical principle, right? So for folks like Aristotle and Plato, that general ethical principle that could be appealed to in a community in the Greek city-states was, well, how can we all live and interact and get along with each other so that we can all maximize the possibility of each of us being able to live the good life as we see it, right? So that we could attempt to unify society, make society a genuine community by referencing, by appealing to this larger principle of the good life, right? And in the early Christian period, the general ethical principle was, well, how can we all live and gather and work with each other cooperatively in such a way that we all maximize our chances of achieving eternal salvation, eternal life when we leave this earth, right? How can we all behave on earth in such a way that we end up going up to heaven when we die, as opposed to going down to boil for all eternity in the lake of fire, right? But guess what? Someone like Hobbes is not able to attempt to unify a very diverse society with dramatically competing interests like that of England during the Cromwellian Revolution. You can't unify the English people by saying, hey, let's all get to work together or we'll all go to hell, right? Or let's all work together so we can all live the good life. Trying to appeal to those ethical or religious principles wouldn't be enough. The people be like, yeah, right. We have other things that we're worried about. We're starving, whatever it is, right? Who cares what you're saying? So you see the basic problem there. Simply appealing to some general ethical principle isn't going to work. So how do you do that? How do you genuinely create a workable community within a diverse society if you can't, appeal to considerations of the good life, if you can't appeal to the idea of eternal salvation? What do? You need a grand and big and large scale plan. And this was not something that was going to prove to be an easy thing to accomplish. So what do you think? Does that make sense? Do you see kind of what's going on here? Do you see the central problem that folks like Hobbes were facing? And at the same time, do you see how this central problem that we're talking about really forces Hobbes to find a much broader, a much grander, a much more permanent sort of large scale solution to this problem? questions about this, comments, problems, complaints, challenges, anything like that, please let me know. Open up your mic, put something in the group chat. Are we good with this stuff? Are we making sense so far on a Monday morning? Anybody? All right, so I'm getting some positive affirmation in the group chat. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that. It's good to kind of remind me that you're still here, because I can't see any of you or hear any of you right now. So that information is always a good thing. Otherwise, again, silence implies understanding, right? We'll stick with that principle from law school for right now. All right, so how do you do this then? How do you actually go about fulfilling this grandiose task that modern political philosophers like Hobbes have set for themselves? How do you go about creating this large scale, hopefully permanent political and governmental solution when society is no longer considered to be a single unifying community? Well, if you scroll down your notes a little bit, take a look at point capital B under Roman numeral number 2. Here is something that we talked about as one of our major course themes at the very beginning of the semester. And look what it says there in point capital B. Through the art of political creativity, community could be created, even though it did not exist through nature. Now, that first sentence there in point capital B is really important. I probably should have bolded it in your notes. I'll make a mental note for myself to do it next semester. As a matter of fact, I'll do more than that. I'll actually do it in my copy of the notes right now so I don't forget. There we go. But it's a really, really key element, though. Got to tell you, sounds good, right? But it's very much easier said than done. Listen to that again. Through the art of political creativity, community could be created even though it did not exist through nature. Okay. Now, let's think about that for a second. Let's go on, continuing on in point capital B. According to Wolin, this was the challenge for all political theorists of the 17th and 18th centuries, not just Hobbes. And I give you a brief quote there from page 217 of Wolin. Quote, chaos was the material of creativity, not a cause for resignation, unquote. As with many theorists preceding Hobbes, crisis brings about opportunity. So here is where two of the major course themes that we talked about at the beginning of the semester, back when we were still face-to-face on campus, kind of collide. They kind of smash together. And in a very hopeful, but not always practical and effective way. Because think about what we're saying here. This idea that crisis brings about opportunity. Well, what's the crisis that folks like Hobbes are facing? They are facing these very diverse societies that do not exist naturally. They do not exist organically as communities. They are composed of all of these diverse, competing, sometimes warring factions who all have divergent interests. That's a crisis, because if you've got constantly warring factions with divergent interests in the society, and there's nothing that naturally binds these competing factions together, what's going to happen? You're going to have chaos. You're going to have instability. In extreme cases, you could have civil war. like you did in Cromwell's time in England, like you did in France in the late 1780s, as you had in the United States in the 1860s, right? How do you cope with that? Well, you don't just give up. You can't just say, oh, well, that's how it works. Nothing we can do about it. Let everything fly apart at the seams. That's not it, right? Doesn't work that way. That's why Wolin says chaos was the material of creativity, not a cause for resignation. In other words, you can't just give up. If you've got this difficult solution, you got to start thinking outside the box. You need to think in a very creative way, okay? But guess what? Nothing hopefully will spur creativity like a sense of crisis, but also a sense of fear. Look at point capital C. This creativity, however, is also motivated by a powerful sense of fear, derived from Hobbes' experience with England teetering on the brink of what Hobbes himself referred to as nothingness, the complete dissolution, the complete collapse of organized society due to a sudden revolution. And this fear prompts the development of Hobbes' political model. And if you've read both the Political Philosophy, a Graphic Guidebook, and if you've also read through chapter 8 in your Wolin book, you know that because of all of this, Hobbes is inspired to develop his political model by this core concept, this thought experiment that is probably the thing that Hobbes is still best known for today. And it was the subject of what is seen by most people as being Hobbes's best and most compelling masterwork, Leviathan, this concept of the state of nature. Now, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the state of nature before we wrap things up. We've got about 8 minutes left because it is such a key concept for Hobbes. But before I do, I wanted to step back to this notion of crisis and fear being this powerful spur to creativity. And I want to connect this very old idea to a very current example that we are experiencing right now, which of course is the COVID-19 crisis. Certainly, the COVID-19 crisis is spurring a lot of instability, a little bit of chaos, right? And it certainly is engendering a huge amount of fear in most all of us, okay? And obviously, for some of us at least, we're not seeing, at least at the national government level, certainly, but in a lot of states too, we're not seeing enough creative thinking to help us better cope and survive and thrive during this crisis from government. But that does not mean that there isn't creativity being spurred by this crisis, being spurred by the fear in other parts of society. Some states, for example, and I will include our own state of California, but I'll also include the state of New York and the state of Ohio. Some states are taking very creative actions to try not just to limit the spread of COVID-19 and prevent our healthcare system from collapsing, but also trying to do the best they can to help people with the various economic crises that are a very real byproduct of COVID-19. So there is some creativity, there is some creative thinking, some out of the box innovation going on in some of our governments here in the United States, though I think we'd like to see a heck of a lot more, and hopefully we will, right? But at the same time, we are seeing some creative out-of-the-box solutions from other people. For example, in our own city of Long Beach, right? You might have seen the announcement, got a lot of publicity from Mayor Garcia the other day. Virgin Galactic, which is the company that the private company led by Richard Branson, that is, working on space exploration and that sort of thing, has temporarily shifted their creativity and their production at their factory in Long Beach to the creation of new, very innovative and very low cost ventilators, right? Because remember, for a lot of people suffering from COVID-19, they need assistance when breathing in order to survive the disease. And there has been a huge shortage of these breathing assistance products known as ventilators, not just in California, not just in the United States, but in most countries around the world. And so the question is, how do we make up for the dramatic shortage in these assistive breathing devices? And so Virgin Galactic, who previously was not in the medical field at all, they weren't developing medical products or anything like that, along with other non-healthcare related companies like Dyson Company in Great Britain, that manufactures, vacuum cleaner, high-end, some would say, my daughter would say, really bougie vacuum cleaners and hair products and stuff like that. They also developed a very new, very innovative, very out of the box, very simple and relatively inexpensive ventilator. And so these folks, for them, chaos and fear are leading to creativity. So this is a valid concept that Wolin is talking about, not just in the time of Thomas Hobbes, but also in the present day. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, so let's take about our last 5 minutes or so together and just talk briefly about the state of nature, because here's the thing. Hobbes's grandiose political model, his out-of-the-box thinking, his hopefully eternal constitution, which didn't turn out to be so darn eternal, centers around this thought experiment that he did, that he talks about in, again, his masterwork, Leviathan, this concept of the state of nature. What Hobbes tried to figure out was, what was life like in the world in the absence of any form of political organization, in the absence of countries, governments, even tribes? What was it like early on in the world before there was any recorded history? So we don't know what the world was like back then. We can only speculate. And that's what Hobbes did with the state of nature. And in the state of nature, Hobbes described it. This is kind of the quote from Hobbes that you may have already heard even before you came into this course, before you did any readings on Hobbes. Hobbes described life in the state of nature before any government, any organized societies, any communities as being nasty, brutish, and short. He described life in the state of nature as essentially being, quote, the war of all against all, that all people were permanently engaged in conflict to the death with each other. Now you're thinking, oh God, that sounds pretty awful. Why is that? What brings about the war of all against all in the state of nature? A very key concept that was also one of our major course themes at the beginning of the semester: fundamental resource scarcity in the world. We live in a world of limited resources. There's only so much food to go around, only so much capability to produce food, only so much clean, drinkable water. There's only so much, petroleum in the ground to, power our cars. Not that we use them right now much, but, you get the idea, right? That all of the basic resources that we need to sustain life on this planet come in limited quantities. And in certain places, there's a lot more demand for these scarce resources than there is supply. And so what happens? If you don't have enough food or water or shelter from the elements for you and your family to survive, but you see somebody else down the way who does, what do? Well, you're going to take that stuff from them. You're going to steal those resources that you need so you and your family survive, even if that means going down to the person down the road to their place and slitting their throat in the middle of the night and taking their stuff. If you ever heard the expression, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Well, yeah, that was life in the state of nature, according to Hobbes. Nasty, brutish, and short. So you're thinking, okay, well, fine, that's nice. Who cares? Why did Hobbes need to come up with this idea of the state of nature? Well, think about it, right? Think about what we've talked about in the notes so far. Hobbes says that there is no naturally occurring solution to this problem of scarce resources. Nothing that we know that exists in nature can prevent the war of all against all. Therefore, in a sense, an artificial solution has to be discovered and has to be imposed on society. And that non-natural artificial solution is governance. And you have to have an all-powerful and very strong, sovereign, independent government if you are going to overcome the state of nature. Because left to their natural tendencies, people are going to attack each other. People are going to steal each other. That's how we survive, right? So Hobbes says, look, as society becomes more diverse with more competing interests, and there's more conflict, and there's no community, and there's less unity, we have to impose the artificial solution of an all-powerful, sovereign, independent government to maintain order and prevent chaos in society. And if that government's got to get kind of brutal to maintain order, well, then so be it. That becomes necessary. And Hobbes believed that such a government could be determined and created and could exist indefinitely. And that's how and why this concept of the state of nature was such a key element of the political model that Hobbes developed. Does that all make sense? Questions, comments, problems about the state of nature or about anything that we've said this morning about Hobbes and his political philosophy? Anybody? All right, so we have gone over by a couple of minutes. I apologize for that, but let me go ahead and briefly wrap up. Remember, start looking for grades for test number 2, starting sometime tomorrow, probably tomorrow afternoon, and I'll try and get those done as quickly as I can. But, you know, I want to spend quality time going through each one, so bear with me, be patient. Also, remember your next discussion forum post dealing with good old Hobbes and the stuff we were just talking about is due this Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day or 72-hour grace period tacked on to the end of that. So you have some extra time to complete the assignment for full credit if you are not able to get it done and posted by tomorrow or by Wednesday at 11:59. Okay. And if you have questions about the class, about the assignments, or about anything that I can help you with, or if you just need to talk to me for a few minutes and vent about life in general, I'm here for you. Send me a Canvas message, send me an email, stop by during my virtual student hours. Remember, every Monday and Wednesday afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And the link and password for those student hours is available on our homepage for this course in the basic course information section. Please feel free to join me. And if you want to talk to me one-on-one via Zoom and those student hours don't work, they conflict with another class, or they conflict with your job, or conflict with something else that you're doing, send me a Canvas message or an email, and let's work out a time that we can set up a one-on-one Zoom appointment. I'm always happy to talk with you, okay? So we'll do this again next Monday, again from 10 until 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Remember, in a few hours, today's broadcast will be available to you via the ConferZoom link on our Canvas page. So please feel free to rewatch if you need to, all or part. And remember, we are going to get through this. We're going to get through this class successfully, and we are going to get through this crisis successfully. And we are going to do that because we are not alone. In all of this, class and whatever else is going on in the world, I'm with you. I've got your back. I'm here for you. So please never hesitate to reach out to me when you need to. We'll get ourselves through together. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all so much for being a part of this class this semester. I know this is not easy. It's tough to keep going on through this week to week. I am so appreciative of your efforts. I am so very proud of you, not just as students, but as people. Hang on, keep going, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye.